Today, I'll talk a little bit about the future of knowledge and creative working. This obviously, again, overlaps with what Morgan was saying. Unlike Morgan, I don't have any hard data to give to you, so I'm just going to extrapolate from some anecdotes that I found interesting and make some wild predictions based on those. So let's dive into that. So anecdotes. The first thing is I work at Mersive, which is a company in Denver, and it's traditionally been very remote skeptical, I would say, not at all remote friendly, except in very rare circumstances. Of course, the pandemic has certainly challenged that mindset, and we've essentially gone from having everybody in Denver to a very distributed workforce. People I worked with previously in Denver, one guy has moved on a whim, his whole family to Pagosa Springs. He was visiting some friends there, and decided before they even left that they would buy a house, and they had actually sold their house remotely here in Denver before they even returned to Denver, which was kind of wild. Another guy moved to live with his sister in Tennessee. You probably know stories like this. Another of my team members actually moved with her boyfriend to Paraguay, of all places, the only landlocked country in South America, just a few time zones over from us. My sister is, when her lease runs up, she's moving her family to Italy, to Milan, Italy. So pretty wild stories, but I'm guessing if we took a poll here, I'm guessing a few of you have heard some of these stories as well. People kind of finally pulling the trigger on moving somewhere wild. Maybe they've dreamed of moving elsewhere for a while, and the disruption of the pandemic has kind of push them over the edge into, well, if I'm already disrupted and I'm already kind of, in a place I didn't expect to be, might as well, take some control over it and move elsewhere. And in a world where almost half of Americans are working remotely, that becomes very realistic. And just to wrap up that story, essentially, we've gone from being remote skeptical to very remote friendly, and that's not going to change back when the pandemic ends. I think about half of the people I work with are eager to actually return when it's safe to do so, but the other half has no intention to do that. And so as Morgan pointed out, the ship has sailed, the cat's out of the bag, whatever metaphor you want to use there. So I think that's an interesting anecdote. And again, I think you could probably identify with that yourself, or know friends who do. Another little anecdote here, you may have seen this in the news. Alphabet, the parent company of Google, has decided, or at least, no, I shouldn't say the whole company, actually about 700 of the 130,000 Alphabet workers have decided to unionize, and that's been growing. This is, if you understand union terminology, this is what's called a minority union, which you probably would have indicated by the fact that it's only a few hundred of these thousands of workers. But they've made enough of a splash now that it'll be interesting to see where it goes in the future. And they're already having influence on the Silicon Valley scene and the tech world in general. Their mission is very sort of social justice oriented, protecting whistleblowers, balancing the interests of workers and users and investors. But even outside of Google and Alphabet, you're seeing these pressures from companies that don't yet have any notable unionization. Microsoft, excuse me. Microsoft, has gotten pressure from internally to cancel Pentagon contracts, for instance. Amazon's also gotten pressure. Politics and work are sort of intermixing like never before. I think you're going to continue to see that going forward. Another data point here, you may have also seen this if you follow Hacker News religiously like I do. This popped up a week or two ago. Sahil Vingia, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. He's an individual who started a company back in 2011, uh, pretty conventional company, peaked at about 23 employees and then ran out of money in 2015. So he kind of rebooted that company on his own in 2016 and decided to do it differently. And really interesting story. The company's now far more profitable than they ever got close to being in the early days. They now have no full-time employees. It's 25 or so part-time contractors working between 10 and 20 hours a week. And in fact, they have a negative overtime policy, which means if you do decide to work more than 20 hours per week, you get docked 50% of your pay. So there's a very, very clear disincentive to doing that. So some other notable facts, and he's got a great blog post on this. There's no meetings, there's no stand-ups, there's no real deadlines per se. It's really just a bunch of individual contributors pulling stuff off the backlog that they find interesting and working on it. You know, there was one case study of a guy who had been making, you know, $500,000 a year working in New York for a pretty high pressure job, putting in, you know, ridiculous hours, decided, you know, he could make 100 grand a year putting in 10-hour work weeks and has never looked back. The other interesting thing about interesting thing about that story is they have recently instituted a location independent pay policy, which basically means it doesn't matter whether you're in India or San Fran or Europe or whatever, you get paid the same for the same work, which is pretty mind-blowing, certainly, and very non-traditional if you're used to a very cost of living oriented paying model. And there's a lot of other interesting things to say about that company. I encourage you to look it up. So let's move on to predictions, sort of recklessly extrapolated from those bits and pieces of anecdotes. So the first thing I'm predicting, and this is somewhat in line with what Morgan was saying, but looking forward indefinitely, that I expect that 40 to 50% of knowledge workers after the pandemic will continue to work remotely, and that will stay pretty stable indefinitely. I don't think it's going to kind of grow or shrink from that significantly. I think there are going to be people who just prefer to work in person. That's just how that suits them better. And so they're going to do that at their earliest opportunity, and then the other half is going to you know, prioritize other aspects to life and choose remote. The next one will be kind of following that that thought. I think time zones will still matter, but not as much as they used to. Again, Gumroad, the company I was just talking about, they have a policy, you know, they don't really have meetings except ad hoc, you know, impromptu sorts of Slack meetings. But the expectation is that all communications, the primary mode of communication, I should say, is asynchronous, meaning you can reasonably expect a response within 24 hours, but no sooner necessarily, which, as you might imagine, 24 hours, it's not a coincidence that kind of, you know, the intention is to erase time zones so that everyone is on equal footing in terms of collaboration. Obviously, I'm sure you can all imagine drawbacks to that, but for some people, it works really well. The next item here is on the subject of unions. I think knowledge worker unions, white collar unions will proliferate, but look different than traditional unions because they are motivated by different goals. You know, rather than, you know, worker safety being obviously primary, you know, if a coal miner, you know, is starting a union, they're going to be more oriented to worker safety. Whereas knowledge workers, there's a different set of priorities: social justice, you know, equality, those sorts of things. And then finally, final prediction here is that part-time work, hourly contracting, self-employment, and job sharing. If you haven't heard of job sharing, the idea there is you're basically splitting a full-time job with two, between two or more people. All those are going to become more common. I think the pandemic has forced a sense of sort of reckoning and reflection on lifestyles and priorities that we haven't really seen before. There's a dark side to that. Apparently, divorces are through the roof. So people are kind of reflecting on, who do I want to spend my time with, my life with in the future? What company do I want to spend my time with? How do I want to balance work life and everything else? Where do I want to live? All those things are sort of up for renewed examination. And so I think that's going to be reflected in how people work and the relationship they have with their employer, if they have an employer at all. And so I think it'll be interesting. The last few bullet points I think are a little bit interrelated in a maybe non-obvious way, but I sort of foresee potentially a union-oriented white-collar gig economy to complement, this sort of proliferation of a blue-collar gig economy, in the area of, ride sharing and food delivery and that sort of thing. Whether any of this comes true, I have no idea, but there you go.